Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. We want to welcome our friends in South Africa, the United States, and around the world to this week's edition of A Conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. I'm pleased to be your host, coming to you once again through the Salam Media platform out of Johannesburg, South Africa. Salam Media is an online portal for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. Our topic for today, very thought-provoking topic with a equally thought-provoking guest. Revisiting the political persecution of Dr. Sami Al-Arian 20 years later. Lessons learned. Dr. Sami Al-Arian is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University. Originally from Palestine, he lived in the U.S. for 4 decades. If my numbers are correct, my dates, from 1975 to 2015. Brother Sami was, while in the U.S., a tenured professor and a prominent human rights-oriented political activist. He relocated to Turkey after years of unjust imprisonment in the U.S. He is the author of several studies and books. We have known each other for a number of years, a good number of years. It is my pleasure to welcome my brother to today's broadcast. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam, brother. Thank you for your kind introduction.
Alhamdulillah. My brother, it's been 20 years this month since the persecution saga of Dr. Sami Al-Arian began. Now, for someone who doesn't know the narrative, how would you describe your story?
Once again, thank you for inviting me. Yes, it's been 20 years since that dreadful day on February 20th, 2003. The persecution itself, more than the prosecution, the persecution itself was for many years. As you said, I was a tenured professor at university. Excuse me for my voice. And for many years, many quarters, particularly Zionist quarters, they were not happy with my activism, whether it was on the issue of Palestine or the issue of foreign policy or the issue of Islamophobia or the issue of American hegemony across the world or Israeli brutality and occupation. So they were trying to get me fired or dismissed from the university. And that created some problems. I was put on leave for a number of years while an investigation was pending in the mid-90s. That investigation came basically saying that what we were doing, whether it was on campus or off campus, was quite not only legal, but it was needed for American society. We were completely absolved of any wrongdoing during that time. After 9/11, there was an opportunity for these same Zionist quarters to try to again pressure the university to dismiss me. By that time, we had a different university president. She was quite vulnerable to these kind of pressures. She herself had charity in Israel. And of course, she didn't do anything, actually. She was passive until 9/11 happened. And then they took the opportunity to send me a notice of dismissal. That notice of dismissal, which was based on really fake reasons, saying that even though I was threatened by some people, nameless people, they said that really disrupted campus, and therefore they wanted to dismiss me. But the different unions, whether it was at the university itself, the professors and the faculty union or the Senate, or across the state of Florida, or even across the nation, they stood with me and thought that this was totally unacceptable, inappropriate. Nothing was like it since Angela Davis in the 60s, when Ronald Reagan was trying to dismiss her from her tenured position took place. And the next that happened, just to put it in context, that happened within weeks after 9/11. So the notice was sent in December 2001, and for the entire year of 2002, I was put in on leave. I was not allowed to go to campus. And meanwhile, the university president was trying to appeal to everybody, every politician, including eventually to the U.S. attorney in the Middle District of Florida, to do something about it, because everybody was standing against her, whether it was the faculty union, whether it was the faculty union across the state of Florida, or even nationally, particularly the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, which launched its own investigation. And by the spring of 2002, sent a warning that unless I was reinstated by August, they're going to censure the university, put it in a blacklist, which meant at the time that the university not only will have a black mark, but they will have difficulty recruiting good faculty or honor societies and so on and so forth. So when she basically gave up on trying to get me out, they offered me in August, on the eve of that deadline, a large sum of money to resign. And at that time, I said, let me see it in writing and I would decide. But she went to the university chairman of the board, was appointed, was a political appointee. The people who voted to dismiss me, the overwhelming majority of them were not academics. These were hired people by the governor at the time, Jeb Bush, and mostly Republicans and business people. And he said, I'm not going to give this person $1 million over my dead body. Leave it to me. I'll take care of it. I've been calling him terrorist for a year. That's not going to happen. He went to the governor and they asked to buy time. So instead of giving me something in writing and fearing the censure, they sued me in court to dismiss me, believe it or not. First in state court in August, which was rejected. That case was dismissed. Then they went to federal court. That case was dismissed in December 2002, and which meant that now I was suing them for their gross encroachment on my rights. And by February, of course, I was indicted with an unbelievable bloated indictment. The government was asking for 3 life sentences on several conspiracies that they put together, plus 220 years. And of course, it was a very difficult time, and just to think about such charges that we're talking about, an indictment that was 160 pages. Most indictments are about 15, 20 pages or so. Mine was 160 pages. They put together several defendants. Many of the people I knew at the time, they were brought into this case so that to make it as if it was a conspiracy. Many innocent lives and families were railroaded by the government for the sole purpose of trying to get rid of me because of that political pressure that was put on the university and eventually the government.
Yes, I had forgotten that Jeb Bush was the governor when all of this was taking place. And that brings me to another a question that often comes up in conversations that I have with others, especially Muslims, Muslim leaders and activists, when your name comes up and what happened to you comes up. The That historic block vote that went to George Bush, that you, if there was any individual, given the fact that they said Florida what made the difference in that election campaign, if there was any individual that was most responsible for orchestrating or helping to orchestrate that victory of George W. Bush at the polls, it was Dr. Sami Al-Arian. That was a historic block vote. Now, I understand why that block vote took place. I was present, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happened uh, in the lead up to that election and to that, very impressive hearing that took place on Capitol Hill against secret evidence that you spearheaded. Well, I understand the logic behind the block vote, but for those who didn't, who are not conversant with that history, didn't understand, or refuse, or maybe conversant with that history, but refuse to understand what went behind that. Please share with the audience why you were a spearhead in organizing that block vote for George W. Bush, and your afterthoughts now in 2023.
Right. Well, we have to go back, of course, to the mid 90s. The United
Yes.
States was the sole hegemonical power in the world. They were trying to pass certain legislations in the country to make it more like a surveillance national security state for whatever reasons. And there was strong opposition in Congress. So the security agencies tried to go about it in stages. The first stage came in 96. In 96, there was a legislation passed, particularly during the presidential election year between Bob Dole and Bill Clinton. And they passed a legislation that allowed the use of secret evidence in immigration courts. And starting in April 96, between April 96 and April 98, for about 2 years, 28 cases were passed where secret evidence was used against Arabs and Muslims. Actually, 29 cases, 28 of which were against Arabs and Muslims. The last one was against a Tamil Tiger guy. And that meant really that this was a big problem for our community. They would take certain people from different backgrounds, mostly Arabs, but also non-Arabs, in which they would be taken from their communities, they would be placed in jail. Secret evidence, meaning that the defendants, their lawyers, have no idea why they were arrested or why they're being deported, why they're being prosecuted. And we wanted to do something about it. We thought that this was a targeted practice against our community. And if we don't know anything about it, it was just becoming more frequent, in which our communities were being terrorized. Our community in Tampa, Florida, at the time was also hit by that. My brother-in-law happened to be the victim. Your community also, Dr. Anwar Haddam, was hit, and many communities in Detroit, Los Angeles, Chicago, all across the nations, New York, we were cases popping up every single month, one or two or more cases. And we thought that every community that was targeted and prosecuted, or persecuted rather, that community would have to win its civil rights battle before they become respected, before they could actually have other rights given to them. And that was a consensus. Yes, I spearheaded that effort. And I think you were part of that effort too, we got together almost over 40 organizations, many non-Muslim, by the way, and many local committees that were trying to defend these victims of secret evidence. I was elected to be the president of that effort. It was called National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom, NCCPF. And we had a very, I don't have time to go over everything we did, but we did a lot on many fields, in the legal fields, in the public fields, in the political field, in the media, in the community level, and so on and so forth. And remember, by 2000, we had legislation. I did a lot of lobbying personally, me and my family and other friends in Capitol Hill, in which we were able to introduce legislation. We had 129 people who actually, in Congress, who actually co-sponsored that legislation. We had 2 hearings in Congress. And this is no small measure, when you talk about scheduling 2 full hearings. On one hand, we had David Cole, who was a constitutional law professor at Georgetown, the ACLU legal director, Greg Nujayim. We had one of the victims of secret evidence, and we had one of the family members of the secret evidence, victims. And on the other hand, there was American Jewish Congress, American Jewish Committee, ADL, and Stephen Emerson, the notorious Islamophobe pseudo journalist, and these were actually the people who were fighting us every step of the way. And by September of 2000, we had a markup, and there was a vote in the Judiciary Committee. And because of that massive effort that we were doing, we got the vote in our favor 26-2. For the first time, legislation that was impacting our community directly, we were able to win it with that massive vote against the Zionist lobby. Of course, we had only a few months left to pass it in that Congress with very heated presidential elections. At the time, I had not good relationship, but I had access, I'd say, to both the Republican and the Democratic Party. As we were lobbying Congress, we were also lobbying the administration, which was responsible for these cases, even though we were able to stop the use of secret evidence at the local level. In other words, by April 98, because of the involvement of many organizations, including many churches in Florida, that effort came from our involvement in Florida. We had a meeting. We had 20 religious institutions, 19 churches and one mosque meeting at the Justice Department in April of 1998. And we were able to take the decision of approving secret evidence cases from the district level all the way to the level of the Attorney General, who was Janet Reno at the time, or her deputy, Eric Holder. And from April 98, not a single case was approved. So we were able to stop the bleeding, but we wanted to also end this practice, and that couldn't happen except by legislation or through legislation. And that's when our efforts started to introduce that bill and try to get it approved. So during that election year, I approached both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I did meet with both. I met with Clinton, President Clinton and his wife at the time, trying to lobby them, but they were not very responsive at all. The Republicans would give you some support, but nothing concrete until October of 2000, because at that time, the presidential elections were so tight. Everybody was working for an advantage. I was approached by a very prominent Republican on the eve of the second debate. He knew how much I was involved in the case and the issue and my connections to the rest of the American Muslim community and leadership. He called me point blank that evening on the eve. I had no idea that's going to happen the following day, but he called me and said that he got a call from Karl Rove, who was leading or the head of Bush's campaign. What would it take to get the Muslim community's endorsement? And immediately I told him what I've been telling you all along, what I've been telling that person who was very prominent in the Republican Party. I said, he needs to say that he's against the use of secret evidence. He also needs to say that he is for that legislation in Congress that we're trying to pass. We passed it in the Judiciary Committee in the House, and now it's pending in the Senate. And that legislation in the Senate at the time was being sponsored by Spencer Abraham, who was a Republican from Michigan, and Edward Kennedy, who is a Democrat from Massachusetts. I did not expect that the following day that the Bush would talk about it in the debate. I thought he might release a statement or say something on the stump speech, but I was very surprised, to tell you the truth, when Jim Lehrer, who was the moderator of that debate, told both candidates, Bush and Gore, the discussion was about racial profiling, trying to stop African Americans while driving and all that. Then Bush pivoted from that question. He said, of course, I'm against it, but there is another form of racial profiling used against Arabs and Muslims. It's called secret evidence. It's wrong. There is legislation in Congress sponsored by Spencer Abraham that needs to be passed. Everything I asked for, he said, before 62 million Americans. So right after the debate, I get a call from the same guy. He said, I delivered. Are you going to deliver now? And of course, I had already at the time promised him that if that happens, I will work to try to get the endorsement of the American Muslim community. So immediately I called everybody. We had a conference call that night. with all the prominent American Muslim political organizations or public affairs committees. And I laid out the whole case that this has nothing to do with Iraq, has nothing to do with Palestine, has nothing to do with any other case, with any other issue, but with one issue and one issue only, which we coined and we agreed for many years before that, since '97, that the issue of secret evidence is so central to our struggle in America that if we can win this, then we will have a seat at the table. So a decision was made. A decision was made that evening that we will endorse Bush based and only based on this fact that he is going to end the use of secret evidence, and that will prop us to become a community that is fighting for its civil rights and is able to go forward with other issues. I might say that the following Monday, of course, we had a Washington. All the major organizations endorsed it except for one. That was the Coalition for Good Government. Our brothers, the African Americans from Wardin Muhammad group, and their chairman, he was sitting next to me in the press conference, and he said, "Of course, we cannot endorse it because we're traditionally Democrats. We can't go and endorse Bush. But we totally understand why this decision is made. We're not going to endorse it, but we understand it." And he tacitly agreed with me that that was an understandable decision. It has nothing to do with any other policy. For the next month, or for the next 3 weeks or so, I lobbied heavily because what we did, what does that mean that we endorsed them? We identified 6 states where Arabs and Muslims across America could make a difference. Florida was one of them. And Florida, I was assigned to work for Florida. It was Michigan, Florida, and a few others. So I worked pretty hard for the next 3 weeks. And by the way, Jeb Bush knew exactly what I was doing. He was giving me all the contact people within the campaign in Florida. He later on said he never heard of me. He doesn't know me. It's a lie, because we communicated, we met, and he gave me the person by which I would be coordinating the efforts of Arabs and Muslims. And on that election day, the Arabs and Muslims, and we did this scientifically, they gave about 74% of the votes of Arab and Muslims to the Republicans, to the Republican nominee. And there were about maybe 18% or so to Gore, and the rest went to Nader. The idea here is that we may not be hundreds of thousands of votes. I believe that we gave at least 15 to 20,000 more votes to Bush than Gore. That's according to our study after the elections. And Bush won. By the way, he would not have gotten that because the Democrats within the Muslim community are registered 2-1 over Republicans. So traditionally, more Muslims will vote Democrats at that time than Republicans. But because of that effort, it flipped the other way. 3/4 went to Bush because we lobbied heavily in all the mosques and all the centers and organizations. And remember, he won this presidency because he won Florida, and he won Florida by 537 votes. So the Republicans immediately recognized that the Muslim vote made a huge difference in their win of Florida and eventually the presidency. I was invited on the eve of the inauguration in January 2001 to attend that inauguration, and also many prominent Republicans. That meeting happened in the same Republican conduit, the person who called me asking for the endorsement, in his office in Washington, D.C. We had that meeting. And in the meeting, we had John Sununu, who was the chief of staff, the elder one, the chief of staff of the elder Bush. We had Newt Gingrich and Tom Davis, who was in charge of the Republican campaign committee. All three thanked me for that vote. And we thought that we crossed, or we were able to jump a huge hurdle, and that secret evidence was about to be banned. And indeed, we asked him after the elections, now, are you going to deliver? We have delivered. And they said, indeed, we will. Give us time. And it was in the Justice Department that they had some problems trying to get confirmation for Jan Ashcroft. So it took a few months until he was confirmed in the Justice Department. Meanwhile, we renewed our effort in Congress, And then after he was confirmed, I was told that now they are studying the issue and soon they would decide. Over the summer, they called me and they said they have decided, of course, to end that practice. And they asked me to gather all the Muslim leaders across the United States to meet at the White House to make that announcement. That day was 9/11.
Mhm.
Muslim leaders were supposed to meet with Bush at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in which that announcement would have been made, and it would have culminated our struggle to end the use of secret evidence. So that vote has nothing to do with Republican policies, has nothing to do with
Mhm.
their racist attitudes toward Palestine or Iraq or the Muslim world. It was just focused on one issue. People could debate whether that wise or not wise, but at the time, our reading of the issue was that we had to win our civil rights battle of that day in order to advance forward with other issues. Now, Karl Rove himself acknowledges in his memoir on page 325, in which he says that Muslim leaders were supposed to meet with George W. Bush at 3:05 that afternoon. He doesn't say why, but now I can tell you why.
Yeah. Tell me this: has your experience, post all of the madness that took place in the wake of 9/11, has your experience changed your perspective on Muslim political activism, especially in the arena of electoral politics? Has your perspective changed at all?
It's a very good question. It's a deep question that needs to be it needs to be dealt with it at several stages. I believe that Muslims should be involved not only from the top down, what's called electoral politics, but also from the bottom up.
Hmm.
The organizing, the community organizing, and the involvement from the look at the local level all the way up, without having to get bogged down with the other issues of electoral politics, but to get involved in the organizing efforts and with other coalitions to press, what is called civil society organizations, to press the political establishment to change. But I don't believe that's enough on its own. So the question is, if you get involved in electoral politics, are there any red lines? At the time, we had red lines. What I see currently in many organizations is that they just don't have, either they don't have red lines or don't care about having red lines. So they are willing to cross many red lines in trying to seek access or get certain things done, which usually is not very principled. So people could easily criticize the involvement in electoral politics. But the problem is that in the United States, to get things done, politicians, political institutions are the ones who get things done. So being on the sideline and just looking at what's happening and criticizing it and even taking brave and courageous stands is not enough. You really have to get things changed. And I think that I think we need to combine the activism and the speaking up of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. I mean, one with pressure from the outside, the other with pressure from the inside. But at the end of the day, to get any progress done, short of a revolution, is that you have to involve the political establishment and the political system. But my caveat here, my point is that you have to identify you cannot go and try to cooperate and build coalitions with Zionists and said, okay, this is for the sake of this and that. There are some red lines that you have to be aware of that you can't cross because there are principles. You cannot walk over your principles. So it has to be principled stance. But to answer your question directly, I believe that any community, for that matter, they need to get involved in both cases. And within the community, you will find people who hate, abhor the involvement in electoral politics, and that's fine, understandable. And by the way, we did both. I did both. At the local level, we joined an organization called Hillsborough Organization for Progress and Equality, which was a community faith organization, the one that I said was able to stop the use of secret evidence in the Justice Department. There were 19 churches in our mosque. We were very involved in many issues other than secret evidence, and we were able to build coalitions and get them to know us, and we worked together on many levels. You need to build this kind of and by the way, these people had thousands and thousands of votes, so they had access to political to politicians both at the local and the national level. But also, you need to get involved in Washington at the national level, because most of the damage done by government against not only minorities and disenfranchised people in the country, but also across the world, happens in Washington. So if you want to make a difference in these policies, change some policies, and you gotta get involved. And if you don't do that, you'll always stay at the margins. So you gotta involve both ways, but you have to know what the red lines are, and you have to stand your principles.
Mhm. Tell me this, and I agree. I agree with everything you just said, Brother Sami. Uh, a few days ago, a young man, still he's a young man by the name of Majid Khan, was released from Guantanamo. Now, what is distinctive about Majid Khan is that he lived in the United States. He was a citizen of this country. His native land, his native roots are in Pakistan, and just shortly after he graduated from high school, he went back to Pakistan. He went to Pakistan. I don't know if he was born in the U.S. or he was, came here as a young child, but he went to Pakistan. And within a short span of time, again, he was a very young man. He was picked up. He was one of the many rounded up, probably sold for a bounty, and he ended up at Guantanamo. Majid Khan, like so many others at Guantanamo, experienced horrific torture. And he allegedly confessed, quote unquote, to being part of a terrorism conspiracy, being a courier for Al-Qaeda. We don't know if that was a truthful confession or if it was a confession that resulted from torture. We know that he was tortured in very horrific ways. He recently got released, and now there's renewed discussion about Guantanamo and everything that went on there. Given what happened in the United States on January 6, 2021, the quote-unquote insurrection that took place on Capitol Hill, and the fact that of those who have thus far been successfully prosecuted, and from my understanding, all of the cases that have been settled thus far have been successful prosecutions, in a tumultuous event that resulted in the death of a number of people, the serious injury of others, the vandalization of what is supposed to be sacred political ground, hallowed ground. Not one of the persons sentenced thus far has gotten more than 7 years. What's your thoughts on the disparities that this represents in terms of justice, even as it relates to issues of terrorism? What are your thoughts on this? And you're a brother who was wrongfully imprisoned for years.
Well, I mean, the United States has different systems of justice. I mean, in the United States, justice is not blind and justice is not cheap. You have one system of justice which looks at the perpetrators of violators of certain laws in the United States and giving them the benefit of the doubt. And usually they would get the easier or the softer part of the justice system. I mean, you could see, for instance, when it came to drugs, when you do hard drugs or you do soft drugs, and even though cocaine is probably more dangerous than other, like cracks, for example, the people who were uh, persecuted or prosecuted on cracks, they got much, much more prison time than the people who were taking cocaine. And that had to do with race and class. So African Americans and other poor people who would be prosecuted on the use of crack or these kind of drugs, they would get dozens and dozens of more years than the people who will be prosecuted on the use of cocaine. Why? Because that's how the system was designed. Similarly, when it came to Muslims and those who would be called terrorists, particularly who come from an Islamic background or an Arab background, they had a system by which they throw the book at them. Not only you get prosecuted on issues and cases which are not really terrorism at all, but they are being redefined because they have nothing to do with violence. They had to do with political opinions, with associations, with charitable work, with being against government policies or against, frankly, the state of Israel and its apartheid regime. And that would be put under this category. And then they added another thing that's called terrorism enhancement. So if they get you prosecuted, let's say on tax fraud, and whether it is legal or not, whether it is true or not, let's say you got convicted on that, and then they will find a way by connecting this, let's say, to Iraq, or connecting this to Palestine, or connecting it to any other Muslim cause, and they will give it the term terrorism because, unfortunately, and I would say this without reservation, that many of the judges are really quite politically ignorant of these cases. They just buy what the government tells them. They're not very critical on what the government asserts. And then if they accept what the government says, that these are somehow related to quote unquote terrorism, then that 2 or 3 or 4 years that they would have gotten now suddenly becomes 40 because of the so-called terrorism enhancement. Just to give you an example, after my case ended without a single conviction in our case, and we ended it because I agreed to give up my rights and just leave. And then you had this prosecutor who was a Zionist, very well-known Zionist, a racist Zionist, I'd call him. And he was basically trying to get me on other means. So he used this with others as well. He would bring them to a grand jury investigation, ask them to testify on something that is hardly related to anything, and then he would accuse them of. He would get them either way. He can get them either through lying to the grand jury because he thinks they lied, even if they told the truth. And we had that case. He used it against one of the brothers, bin Kahla, Sabri bin Kahla, or you would refuse to testify, as in my case, because I knew his game, and then you will be prosecuted under what is called contempt of court, criminal contempt of court. Now, either one of these, whether you lie or whether you get typically 3 or 4 years. But because he will say that this investigation was in the context of terrorism, that would suddenly become 22 to 25 to 30 years. Now, all the Muslims who were prosecuted after 9/11, I wouldn't say 100%, but the overwhelming majority of them, they really had very little, if anything, to do with any terrorist groups or terrorist action. Most of them actually were manufactured by the government. It was the government who thought of the crime, who designed the crime, who executed the crime, who financed the crime, and these people were just innocent bystanders that they were targeted because of who they are, what they believed, and their faith and association, and suddenly, these crimes that were created by the government that usually would take few years, now they become dozens and dozens and dozens of years. And we have so many examples to show for that. So to make the long story short, to answer your question, yes, when it comes to Muslims and Arabs and and the like, they get a different kind of justice than those who actually perpetrated the January 6th insurrection or the what happened in Congress that year. These are two systems, and the problem, of course, is that not only the participants of the system, the lawyers, the prosecutors, the judges, are blindsided by this. They don't see that they're doing anything wrong. A lot of people could actually be decent people. They just don't see it. And but now you could see the stark difference. Just to give you one example, uh, you know, our brother Ahmed Abu Ali. Ahmed Abu Ali was prosecuted in Virginia by the same prosecutor, by the way, but same Zionist racist prosecutor. And his charge that he was trying to assassinate President Bush. And of course, this came under torture. That so-called confession came under torture in Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately, that torture thing was not told to the jury. So the jury convicted him based on a confession under torture. And there was absolutely nothing to show for that. He wasn't even in the country at the time. He was like 22 years old. He was living in Saudi Arabia, studying in Saudi Arabia. And the confession of trying to assassinate the president at the time came from torture. There was no conspiracy, no one person working with him. It's just something that came out of that confession, out of that tortured confession. What did he get? Life in prison. Fast forward during President Obama, I think it was 2010 or so, in which there was another guy who was an Iraqi veteran. He hated Obama. He was a racist. And not only he wanted to assassinate the president at the time, but he actually recruited people. He bought he bought assassination tools, bombs and ammunition and all kinds of stuff, according to the government, with over $80,000 of stuff. And he recruited a person in which he wanted to assassinate President Obama, who was president. He wasn't former president. He was president at the time in Georgia. Now, the person he recruited got cold feet. He went to the authority and talked about this guy. He was arrested, and he was about 24, the same age as Ahmed Abu Ali at the time. And he went to the judge and confessed to everything. He said he wanted to kill the president, that he bought the equipment, he bought everything that he was going to use, the bomb material and so on and so forth. What did he get? 7 years. So here you see that, what one person would get, and the judge said that he was young. He was young, that he had his whole life in front of him and that he regretted. Where someone, on the other hand, because he was Muslim, even though he was born in the US, and there's zero evidence, absolutely zero evidence, other than that tortured confession that ties him to anything remotely close to what this guy did. So on one hand, you have a person who was sentenced to 7 years and the other to life, who's still in prison today, living underground in Colorado and ADX. So there you have it. And I can, thousands of stories between blacks and whites, how they are being treated in the court system.
Dr. Sami, this this time that we had together has just gone by so fast. I want to apologize to our listening and viewing audience. I had some serious technical difficulties at the time it was supposed to begin, and that's why we ended up getting a late start. We just have a few minutes left in the broadcast. I'd like for you to just respond as succinctly as you can to these last two questions on my list of questions. I had some others. We have to end with these two because I consider them to be very important and just very important questions. The first being, I'd like for you to share with the listening and the viewing and listening audience your thoughts on the brutal imprisonment of a dear sister of ours who will also be marking 20 years next month. 20 years of wrongful imprisonment next month. Dr. Afia Siddiqui. That's the first part of this final question I want to put to you. And the second part is, the takeaways from your experience. What are the takeaways? What kind of advice would you want to leave the community with from this broadcast, given what you have seen and what you have experienced? Afia Siddiqui, and the takeaways from your experience. Go ahead, brother.
Well, in the issue of Dr. Afia, I think it was former Attorney General, the late Ramsey Clark, who said this is he cannot think of any case where the miscarriage of justice was so grievous and so significant and so unbelievable. A victim is turned into a villain, and then somebody who is really suffering from years of torture and detention, and yet, and of course, so from also all kinds of problems, health wise, and yet she was sentenced to 86 years. I mean, it's just beyond belief that something like that would take place without the whole world being outraged. I mean, we've seen people making whole campaigns against human rights abuses and violations of much lesser significance. And yet, here we go, 20 years later, no one really even is talking about her. And when I looked into this case, I found that there are many politicians actually who are part and parcel of her suffering, both not only in the US, but also in Pakistan. And I'm horrified at this. And something needs to be done about it. I mean, enough is enough. She suffered tremendously. Her children, who have not seen her now for close to 2 decades, they need to be reunited with her. She needs to be released, and she needs to get the help that she needs. I'm not sure how this could be done without a massive public and political campaign. On the issue of takeaways, what we termed at the beginning as lessons learned, there are so many. Try maybe to choose a few. I mean, going through such experience, what keeps you going, and the thing that you really need to rely on, and that means you really have to have it before you actually face such a campaign and a trial, and and going through this massive challenge is the importance of faith. I mean, what I really relied on was that it's what makes you stand, it makes you determined, and that you have to keep fighting, and you don't give up, you don't give in. Your faith in Allah is what will sustain you, and that thing doesn't get built up suddenly. It's something that you have to keep that relationship with Allah all the time, with the Almighty, and it is what will sustain you. If you get targeted by the U.S. government, that's a massive undertaking. That's not something that is easy. You could be facing, there could be the end of your life. I mean, I was facing, I said, 3 life sentences plus 220 years. How can you even get out of this? So many people thought, okay, this is the end of Sami. I mean, how can he even get out of it? But we know from, we read in the Quran, وَإِذْ يَمْكُرُ بِكَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لِيُثْبِتُوكَ وَيَقْتُلُوكَ وَيُخْرِجُوكَ وَيَمْكُرُونَ وَيَمْكُرُ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. They try to plot, they try to scheme. The evil people really have 3 ways to get rid of you. They can imprison you, they can kill you, or they can deport you or exile you. These are there's nothing else they can do. These are the 3 things that they could do to you. But they plot, the verse says, and Allah plots, and Allah is the best of plotters. So despite everything they tried under the sun, everything in their power to do, it's really not me. It's just I think it's just the Almighty. And that does not take away from the other struggles. It was Allah's determination, it's Allah's will that and maybe it's an example for others. The other thing I would want to emphasize is the importance of family. I mean, it was these 2 things that really sustained me. And family is very important. I tell everybody make sure you have very close relationship with your family, with your wife, with your parents, with your children. At the end of the day, when everybody goes home, they stay with you. They don't go home. They come to you. They comfort you. They are the ones who give you that extra push to stay strong and stay uh, uh, resolved and determined. The third thing I would add also in the belief is the belief in the justness of your cause. Uh, if you don't believe in your cause, it's very difficult to stand up and take all the challenges and all the things that government is trying to throw at you. The amount of pressure that you get under, both psychological, physical, mental, and so on and so forth, is unbelievable. I mean, the fact that they would put you in a solitary confinement for, in my case, 43 straight months is huge. It's not easy thing to withstand. People, when they go a couple of weeks, they go crazy. So for you to withstand that pressure, it really takes a lot of strength. And that strength comes from that faith, comes also from knowing fully well that there are people outside who are working on your behalf. The other thing is, even though the government has the power to benefit or reward, punish or hurt, at the end it's in the hands of God. It's the hands of the Almighty. Is His will be the one that would prevail, not theirs. Despite that, so you just have to stand strong. The government is very ruthless. It's very brutal. That's the other thing you take, and therefore you really have to be very smart of how you deal with it, and you have to build these coalitions. I can tell you that my relationship with many, many, many friends who are not Muslims, but they knew me pretty well. That was I had an advantage maybe over other cases, is that the people who would come to my trial, who would demonstrate and protest outside, were mostly, and many of them were not Muslims. And the jurors would look at them and said, okay, this is not his community. Why are they out? There's something wrong here. This picture is not typical. It's not the traditional.
Yes.
We really have to go and join hand in hand with those who believe in justice, who believe in these great principles. Human decency transcends faith and ethnicity and nationality or geography. People who are decent are everywhere, and we just have to link up. And particularly in a society like the United States, where you find a lot of people, would sympathize if they know the truth. We just have to speak the truth. We have to stand up for what is truth. The other thing I would also add is strategic thinking and planning is very important. Good lawyering, yes, that's pretty good. I tell people, yeah, I mean, I had excellent, brilliant lawyers, and the government made mistakes, but you really have to, as I said, rely on God, but also try to be strategic in what you do. And finally, excuse me, things happen not because you planned them. You'll see many surprises, but things happen because there is a road that has been set for you, and you have to accept what happens, and you become an example. Malcolm X became an example. Muhammad Ali became an example. The great leaders, they became examples. They didn't know. Muhammad Ali didn't know whether he would, he set an example and work, but whether that example would be adopted, would be accepted by people or not. But he stood his principle, and eventually history said that he had the right stand. Malcolm X is the same. For many years, he was despised, and then he became the icon of what a person, powerful symbol for civil rights and for human dignity and for freedom. These people didn't know that they would be looked up eventually, but because of their stance, history today looks at them as people of great people, and they don't just represent people because they were African Americans, but across all ethnicities, across all people. And I think that's
Absolutely.
very important, that people need to know this, that this is not measured in months and years. This is measured beyond that. And history at the end would look at it in its totality, not because of the heat of that moment.
Okay, we're gonna have to end it on that note, Dr. Sami Al-Arian. I really appreciate you, brother. I appreciate having you on the platform with us today for this conversation. And inshallah ta'ala, we're going to do it again. May Allah ta'ala bless the rest of your, what time is it there in
It's about 10 o'clock in the evening.
Okay, alhamdulillah. May Allah bless you with a peaceful night's rest and a happy morning's rise. And here in this neck of the woods, we're at the early part of the afternoon. I know it's after 8 p.m. in South Africa. Well, yeah, it's probably after 9 p.m. in South Africa. I want to thank our engineer, Brother Sadiq, for doing what he does every week. And inshallah ta'ala, we'll close out as we normally do. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim wal Asr. Innal insana lafi kusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amalu salihati wa tawassaw bil haqq wa tawassaw bis sabr. Which means, in translation of the meaning, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, by the token of time through the ages, surely humanity is in loss, except those who believe and do good, and exhort one another to truth, and exhort one another to patiently persevere. Peace be unto you. Assalamu